Welcome to 5 Books for Catholics, where an expert selects and explains 5 outstanding books in some aspect of Catholic life, doctrine, or culture. Truth is an attribute of God, whereas lying and deceit are characteristic of the wicked. Sacred Scripture stresses this continually. Accordingly, it prohibits lying time and again. The Church brings together all this and teaches that lying is the most direct offense against the truth. To lie is to speak or act against the truth in order to lead into error. By injuring man's relation to truth and to his neighbor, a lie offends against the fundamental relation of man and of his words to the Lord. The gravity of a lie is measured against the nature of the truth it deforms, the circumstances, the intentions of the one who lies, and the harm suffered by its victims. If a lie in itself only constitutes a venial sin, it becomes mortal when it does grave injury to the virtues of justice and charity. That passage was from Catechism of the Catholic Church, numbers 2483 to 84. Nevertheless, the Church's teaching that lying is wrong by its very nature and can never be justified has always been disputed. Virtually everyone acknowledges that lying is wrong in principle. Frequently, however, there have been debates over what counts as a lie. Moreover, many maintain that under certain circumstances, lying may not be wrong at all, but a morally necessary measure to protect the innocent. In this interview, Christopher Tollefsen discusses some of the main theoretical and ethical disputes about lying and recommends 5 books on the subject. Christopher Tollefsen is professor of philosophy at the University of South Carolina. He works broadly in ethics, in an area of natural law philosophy popularly called the New Natural Law Theory. He is the author of Lying in Christian Ethics, published by Cambridge University Press, co-author of The Way of Medicine, Ethics and the Healing Profession, published by the University of Notre Dame Press, and co-editor of Natural Law Ethics in Theory and Practice, a Joseph Ball reader, published by the Catholic University of America Press. Links to the books discussed in this episode are available in the show notes. And if you have a moment, please support this podcast by leaving a top rating on the platform of your choice. Professor Christopher Tollefsen, welcome.
Thanks. Very good to be here.
You've written an excellent monograph, Lying and Christian Ethics. What motivated your extensive research on the theoretical and ethical problems surrounding lying?
That's a great question. I think there are probably 2 defining events in my sort of intellectual formation that led to this. One was time that I spent as a graduate student reading through Alexander Solzhenitsyn's Gulag Archipelago, in which Solzhenitsyn spends, as he did in various other of his writings, a great deal of time talking about the extent to which lies pervaded Soviet life, and the difficulty of being a person of integrity. And that resonated to a certain degree with me as a graduate student at a secular philosophy program. I thought that there was something to be learned there about the importance of speaking one's mind. And then the second thing, probably more proximate importance to the development of that book in particular, I've always been involved in the pro-life movement. I've written a number of things defending the rights of unborn children. And I think around in 2011, there was sort of a lot of news about a pro-life organization that had gone undercover, so to speak, to infiltrate various Planned Parenthood locations, I think in New Jersey at the time, by pretending to be in need of an abortion for an underaged migrant. And this was viewed as a great pro-life triumph because the Planned Parenthood workers were shown as being willing to cooperate in facilitating an abortion for these underaged persons. And I thought it was a disaster. I thought it was really a terrible thing for the pro-life movement to be involved in offenses against truth in service of life. It seems to me that the strongest thing that we have going for us is that we speak the truth, as you know, always in season and out of season, and that it was an impairment of our witness and our ability to pursue the mission that we were willing to lie in service of it. And that got me reading, among other people, Augustine, whose books are on the list of 5 books that I've given you, who was faced with very similar situation, with the attempt of Catholics to infiltrate a heretical sect, the Priscillianists, which they did by lying and pretending to be parts of that sect. And Augustine, I'm ashamed that I was not more familiar with Augustine's work on lying prior to this incident. It seemed to me gave a lot of good arguments for why that was a terrible idea. And so that sort of prompted some early writing that I did for public discourse on the topic. And then I moved from that on a sabbatical that I had at Princeton University in 2011 and 12 to work on that book.
You just mentioned this sort of sting operation that some pro-life members of the pro-life movement carried out in the Planned Parenthood clinics. But the state also sponsors similar types of sting operations with undercover intelligence agents or police officers. Is that licit?
I don't think so. Certainly not. So in the book, I argue, following Augustine and Aquinas and a number of other people, although not a huge number of other people now, that lying is always wrong. So I describe the view as an absolute view about lying. There's a particular kind of act, asserting contrary to one's mind, and it should never be done. And I think that has a lot of consequences for not just church groups, pro-life groups, but also certainly for the government. I think there's a lot of people who think that just as government has authority to use lethal force in ways that private citizens don't, government also has authority to lie in ways that private citizens don't, and that extends to the inclusion of undercover agents in various criminal and terrorist operations. I think if my view is correct, which again is the view of Aquinas and Augustine, then such undercover operations are equally wrong for the state to perform. And it's interesting to me that, for instance, Aquinas did think that the state had certain kinds of authorities to perform acts of intentional killing that private citizens couldn't engage in, but he never suggested anything of the sort with regard to lying. Right? His view is that lying in warfare, for instance, is always wrong. It doesn't matter under what circumstances it's performed. And so in that respect is, I think, even more strict, more absolute than his views on state-sponsored killing.
The first question that needs to be addressed is, what is a lie? There is more to a lie than merely making statements that are untrue. Generally, we make false statements whenever we tell a story or a joke, as when Tolkien says, "In a hole in the ground there lived a hobbit." However, we do not take such statements to be lies. So what is a lie?
Yeah, so I think, and again, this is following on both Augustine and Aquinas. Just as a side note, I'll mention that this question of what is a lie is of intense interest right now among philosophers, especially philosophers of language, and I'll come back to some of the reasons for that in just a minute. But their interest overlaps incredibly with the initial discussion of that question of what is a lie in Augustine's book about lying. I think that it's important for us to recognize that a lie is always an assertion. So when one asserts something, one affirms it to be the case. Right? One affirms that, as is the case, that my wife and children are out of the house thrift shopping right now. Right? And when I assert something of that sort to you, I intend for you to understand me to be affirming it, and to be affirming it as true. And so when you say something on a stage, for instance, when you recite your lines in a play, or when Tolkien says in a hobbit or in a hole there lived a hobbit, or in a variety of other speech acts such as questions and commands, we're not engaged in that act of assertion. We're not affirming something to be the case. And when one lies, one affirms contrary to what one actually believes. So if I thought that my wife was actually upstairs reading a book, and I told you, I affirmed to you, I asserted to you that she was out at a thrift shop, then that would be a lie on this account. Augustine seems to add, although he qualifies it with some in certain respects, he seems to add as a requirement that something be a lie that it be asserted with intention to deceive. And many philosophers today consider that to be the so-called traditional definition of a lie. So it would be an assertion contrary to what one believes with the intention to deceive. Aquinas disagrees with that. He thinks that the essence of the lie is the assertion contrary to what one believes. And many philosophers today think that the intention to deceive is not necessary for a lie because they're impressed with what they call bald-faced liars, people who will lie to you, who are known to be liars, who know that they're known to be liars. Nobody is taken in by them in any respect whatsoever, and yet they seem to be lying. And there's just a huge literature developing over the last 5 years about the bald-faced liar, that goes right back to Augustine. I think it's a testament to the way in which Augustine's writings are of incredible and enduring importance on this issue.
It's also come into this, I suppose, metaethics, this current of anti-realism, which is called fictionalism, with authors such as Richard Joyce or Calderon, where they maintain that there's no such thing as moral goodness or badness, but those who are aware of that have to maintain the fiction as if they were Santa Claus, behaving as if there were objective moral virtues because it's socially useful,
right?
And have to maintain that pretense as if they were playing games like Santa Claus with their children.
Right. I think that view, and Bernard Williams had a lovely expression to describe views of that sort, and you would say that they were not stable under reflection. That is to say, you can't grasp the alleged truth of such a view and continue to operate as usual under it. I think if we genuinely thought that there were no moral norms and that they were all fictions, then we would treat them the way that we treat fictions. We wouldn't give them the same kind of respect that we currently give. I think there are certainly people who are inclined in that direction, but it seems unsustainable as an overall way to treat moral norms. So I think there is an interesting intersection there, but I'm unconvinced by it.
No.
I also have thoughts about Santa Claus that I would be happy to share with you at some point during our discussion.
There's a lot at stake about how one defines lying, and this is a rather long question to set up. Unless we're consequentialists, certain definitions entail an absolutist position, that every false assertion contrary to one's mind is a lie, and so wrong under every circumstance whatsoever. Other definitions are non-absolutist. Asserting a falsehood contrary to one's mind to someone who does not have a right to know the relevant facts is not a lie, and so may be justified under certain circumstances. The moral entailments of the former definition, unlike those of the latter, appear counterintuitive to many people. This is because lying appears to be morally necessary under certain extreme circumstances to protect the innocent. Now, this argument, as you know, is centuries old, but currently the standard case study used to frame it is that of a person who is hiding Jews in a home from the Nazis, but months answer the Gestapo official who's asking whether there are any Jews in their house. The first edition of the Catechism of the Catholic Church appeared to imply that it would not be a lie at all to tell the Gestapo that there were no Jews in one's house. This is because the provisory 1992 edition of the Catechism defined lying in a non-absolutist manner as to speak or act against the truth in order to lead into error someone who has the right to know the truth. That's number 2483. However, the 1997 Editio Typica appeared to rule this out by removing the final clause of this definition and specifying that the other's alleged right to know the truth is not an essential constituent of a lie. Why this change to the more rigid absolutist definition of lying in the Catechism?
So this is a really interesting and extensive question. I think there's a lot of things to be said about it. I think just as a starting point, that particular definition of a lie as speaking falsely to one who has a right to the truth, is a very recent addition to the literature on this, relatively speaking. So this is introduced by Grotius as the definition of a lie, and in a certain way, it pays a kind of homage to the absolutist view about lying, because it preserves absolutism about lying, but in a very formal way, right? In a way that is really almost tautological. So any instance in which you're justified in speaking falsely to someone is going to turn out on this definitional approach not to be a lie. I think the more traditional view, going back to Augustine and Aquinas and really all the figures in between them, almost without exception, is that it's important to separate out the definitional question from the moral question. Right? So one identifies the nature of the speech act that lying belongs to. We talked about earlier, that would be assertion. And one identifies the feature of a lie that makes it a lying assertion as opposed to a sincere assertion. And then one asks the general question whether such a form of speech act can be morally permissible. And of course, different people take different approaches to how to answer that question. There, as you would have seen if you had a chance to look at Julius Dorsinski's dissertation, there's a long tradition of Thomists and neo-Thomists thinking that there's something contrary to nature in speaking in a way that the faculty of speech was not designed for. I think there's other interesting and important approaches that we can talk about. But that's a separate question, the question of whether lying is ever permitted, given that we have an understanding of it that doesn't already introduce moral terms. I think that's an important and helpful way to approach the question, because it doesn't just present us with something that seems like an answer. Well, lying is always wrong when it's done to somebody who doesn't have a right to it, but without actually giving us any content to how to figure out what that means. Right? So we can identify when it is that we're lying, and then we ask more generally the question of whether and when that's permissible. And I think the shift in the catechism reflects the interventions of a number of people who, in one way or another, were in contact with the authors of the catechism to say this definition in the early edition, in the preliminary edition, just does not reflect Catholic thought about this. Grotius wasn't a Catholic. There's a long tradition going back to Augustine of thinking about it in the way that I've just described. And that tradition, where lying is concerned, mirrors our broader tradition. I think this is the focus really of the Finis book that I recommended. It mirrors the larger Catholic tradition of thinking about moral absolutes, which is to identify a natural kind of action independently of moral assessment, and then to bring moral assessment to bear on it afterwards.
In Lying in Christian Ethics, you defend, as you mentioned, an absolutist position and maintain that lying is always wrong under any circumstance, regardless of the agent's noble intentions. Briefly, insofar as possible, how do you defend this controversial position, which is counterintuitive for many people?
It is counterintuitive, and one of the things that emerged from the discussion about Planned Parenthood is that it's not just counterintuitive, it's repugnant to many people. Many people think that it is a morally repugnant view to think that one should never lie for a good cause. And again, just as a side note, I found myself in going back to Augustine for the purposes of refreshing my memory for our interview here, just being so impressed with Augustine's straightforwardness on this. Augustine laid down a position, an absolutist position, that was then dominant within Catholicism for 1,200 years. And people may have disagreed with it in one respect or another, but they didn't find it repugnant. I think that the origin of my view about the wrongness of lying emerges from Thomas Aquinas, actually, who understands the speech act of assertion as within the order of communication. So if I'm communicating something to you by way of an assertion, my affirmation points in two different directions. Right? On the one hand, it points towards the things of the world that I'm talking about. And on the other hand, it points towards me and what I believe about those things in the world. And Aquinas asks, I think, implicitly, more than once, what goods are at stake in communication? And at one point he says something like, well, we owe it to the members of society to provide to them in speech what is necessary for them to flourish as a society. And that looks to some people as if it's a kind of instrumental claim about what we need in order to be able to feed ourselves and to protect ourselves against enemies. And I think that's an important part of the justice and injustice of lies and of truth-telling and lies. But I think there's something deeper that is happening there. In order to have a society at all, in order to have a community at all, there needs to be a common will between the persons of the community. And in order for there to be a common will, there needs to be a common mind. And that common mind can only exist if minds are shared. And the paradigmatic form in which we share our mind with another is through assertion. And so it seems to me that when I assert to you, right, I'm in a way opening myself up to you. I'm opening up one aspect of myself to you in a form of sharing that you can either accept or reject. But that sharing, that initial sharing, and that accepting are what I call in the book the primordial moment of the formation of a community. You just can't have a community unless you have that opening up the self to the other and the acceptance by the other of what it is that's being shared. And for me to assert something to you, right, to offer that aspect of myself in assertion, and then block its realization in a form of community by actually asserting contrary to my mind, contrary to what I believe. It seems to me as a direct, it's an intentional violation or assault on the good of society, the good of community, or the good of friendship that can exist between us. And so even in the most ordinary encounters, if I see somebody on the street and he asks me what time of day it is, or he asks me for directions, I have an opportunity right then and there to initiate a very minor, to be sure, but real form of community by giving him an honest answer, or to block and rupture the possibility of community between me and that person by lying to him. And so the argument that I make, which is a goods-based argument, it's not a normal function of capacity argument, it's a good-based argument, is that the good of society, the good of community, is always at stake whenever one is asserting. And when one lies, one always directly violates that. I would just mention sort of a second part of the argument because I alluded to it earlier. But I think the other good that is at stake, and this was why Solzhenitsyn's writings were of such interest to me as a graduate student, the other good that's at stake is the good of integrity. And you see this mentioned by both Augustine and Aquinas. Augustine talks about the double-mindedness of the liar and the lack of integrity of the liar. And I think that is simply a recognition that when I present myself to you in speech, I can either do so in a way that is integral with who I am and what I believe, or is disjointed from who I am and what I believe. And when I lie, I do it in the latter way. And so there is a failure, there's a rupture, and I think it's deliberate, it's intentional, of my integrity. And so the two goods that I think are at stake are that of society and that of personal integrity, and both are intentionally violated in the lie. Now that still leaves lots of other questions. I mean, I'm sure that we'll get around to talking about the Nazi at the door. You've mentioned him a couple of times, and it's obviously the most important objection to this particular view. But just to make a quick comparison, I think the view is similar in a certain way to one particular kind of understanding of the wrong of contraception. Right? In marital intercourse, one has the opportunity for bringing about new life, and in contraception, one blocks that opportunity. Right? One takes steps to prevent that possible new life from coming into existence. That also seems repugnant to a lot of people, not to a lot of the people who are sort of immediately involved in, for instance, the pro-life argument about lying. So I think there's a disjoining there. I would like those people to see lying in the same light that they see contraception, right, as something that is, in fact, a violation of certain important goods.
Thank you for listening. To read or listen to the rest of this interview and gain full access to our archive, visit 5booksforcatholics.com and become a premium subscriber. If you've enjoyed this episode, please subscribe to the podcast and give it a top rating on the platform of your choice. That way, more people can discover it. You can also support the podcast and help us produce more interviews like this one by making a one-off donation via the link given in the show notes. As little as $1, £1, or €1 can help and will be greatly appreciated. Thank you once again, and God bless.